The Varathi Empire had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time, nothing had ever surprised them. Their sensor network, called the Deep Light Array, stretched across 40,000 star systems like a web made of light and energy, and it watched everything. Every ship, every asteroid, every stray comet that drifted too close to Imperial space, and it never made mistakes. That was what Sensor Adjutant Rillis had been taught from her very first day at the Academy, and she had believed it completely until this exact moment. She sat at her console aboard the Imperial Dreadnought, Throne of Silence, staring at the numbers on her screen with wide golden eyes, and she could not understand what she was seeing. There was an object crossing into the outer border of Imperial space, and it was small, barely 900 meters long, which was nothing compared to the Throne of Silence, a ship that stretched nearly 8 kilometers from bow to stern. But the energy readings coming off this tiny vessel were impossible. The power output was equal to a Varathi battle moon. Rillis blinked several times and checked her instruments, running her fingers across the smooth crystal interface of her console, adjusting the calibration, filtering out background radiation, and compensating for every possible source of interference she could think of. Then she ran the scan again. The numbers came back exactly the same. Her blood went cold, and her hands began to tremble slightly as she raised her head and looked across the bridge toward Fleet Overseer Kethvalen, who stood near the central command platform with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the stars through the great observation window, as if the universe owed him nothing, and he expected even less. "Overseer," Rillis said, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "I have detected an anomalous contact at the border." Kethvalen turned his head, slowly. He never rushed anything, and his pale gray eyes settled on her with the patience of a creature that had commanded warships for longer than most species had existed. "Define anomalous," he said. "A vessel, Overseer, small, under 1,000 meters, but its power output is beyond anything in our classification system," Rillis answered, and she pulled up the data on the main bridge display so that everyone could see it. The numbers floated in the air between them, glowing faintly blue, and several officers on the bridge stopped what they were doing to stare. Kethvalen walked toward the display and studied it in silence for a long time. "You ran the scan twice?" he asked. "Yes, Overseer. Identical results both times." He frowned, and Rillis saw something flicker across his face that she had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something close to confusion, which on a man like Kethvalen was almost the same thing. "Vessel's origin?" he asked. Rillis swallowed hard before answering. "The transponder signal is broadcasting on crude electromagnetic frequencies, completely unencrypted, and the species identifier matches entry 7749 in the Imperial Archives." She paused. "It is human, Overseer." The bridge went silent. Not the comfortable silence of routine, but the heavy silence that falls when something is very wrong. Kethvalen stared at the display, then turned his gaze back to Rillis, as if she had just told him that a fish had learned to fly. "That cannot be a human warship," he said quietly, and Rillis understood why he said it, because she had studied the Imperial Archives herself, and she knew exactly what they said about humans. A Class 11 pre-warp civilization confined to a single unremarkable star system orbiting a yellow dwarf, still burning fossil fuels and fighting wars over patches of dirt on their homeworld. Revisiting for at least another 1,000 years. The file had not been updated in 300 Imperial years. But the numbers on her screen did not care about the archives, and the numbers said that something very powerful was heading their way. The vessel was also broadcasting a message, repeating it over and over in simple electromagnetic pulses, and when Rillis translated it, the words were almost laughably plain. "UEN Perseverance, peaceful transit, we come in friendship." Kethvalen read the message and his frown deepened. "Dispatch an intercept fleet," he ordered, his voice calm and steady, because whatever this was, he was not going to let it rattle him in front of his crew. 12 cruisers in standard formation. They will halt the vessel and determine its true nature. His second-in-command, a tall officer named Dreth, raised one eyebrow ridge slightly. 12 cruisers for a single vessel, Overseer, Dreth asked. That seems excessive. For a ship that claims to come in peace. It also seems excessive for a species that was burning coal 3 centuries ago to have a ship with that kind of power output, Kethvalen replied. So we will be thorough. The orders went out across the deep light relay, and within minutes, 12 Varathi cruisers, sleek, angular warships, bristling with plasma cannons and kinetic batteries, broke formation from the border patrol fleet and surged toward the contact point at faster-than-light speed. Kethvalen watched them go, and then turned back to the observation window, where the stars burned cold and steady against the black. He had commanded the Imperial fleet for 40 years, and in that time he had crushed rebellions, pacified entire star systems, and stared down species far older and far more dangerous than a pack of primates from an unremarkable world. But something about those numbers bothered him. Not the size of them, though they were alarming. Fact that they existed at all. 300 years was nothing to the Varathi Empire. A blink, a footnote, barely enough time to redecorate a government building. But apparently, it had been enough time for humans to go from burning hydrocarbons to building something that made his instruments stutter. He did not say any of this out loud. Instead, he simply stood and watched the stars and waited. Far away, at the exact coordinates where the intercept fleet was heading, the UEN Perseverance drifted through open space like a dark silver seed carried on an invisible wind. It was not a beautiful ship by Varathi standards. It had no elegant curves, no crystalline spires, no glowing energy arrays that announced its power to the universe. Instead, it was blunt and angular, built with the kind of brutal practicality that came from a species that had spent its entire history fighting to survive on a world that seemed determined to kill it. On the bridge of the air, Perseverance, Admiral Naya Okoye sat in her command chair and watched her holographic display with calm, dark eyes. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from absolute self-control. And when her tactical officer reported that 12 Varathi warships were approaching at high speed, she did not flinch. "Right on time," she said softly. Her diplomatic officer, Dr. Lena Moreau, looked up from her console with a worried expression. 12 warships is not exactly a welcome party, Admiral, Moreau said. It is not a war party either, Okoye replied. 12 ships means they are cautious, but not terrified. If they were truly afraid, they would have sent 100. Down in the engineering bay, Chief Engineer Damir Volkov was running his hands over the reactor housing like a man petting a beloved animal, whispering reassurances to machinery that could not hear him, but that he loved. Anyway, easy, easy, he murmured. We have guests coming. Let us make a good first impression. The Perseverance hummed beneath his fingers, steady and strong, and Volkov smiled the tired smile of a man who had not slept properly in 3 years, but who would not trade his work for anything in the universe. Above them, the stars waited, and across the void, 12 Varathi cruisers raced toward a meeting that would change the galaxy forever. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, surrounding the Perseverance in what Imperial tactical doctrine called the Cage of Compliance. A ring of warships designed to cut off every possible escape route and remind the target that resistance was not just futile, but foolish. From the outside, it looked like a pack of wolves circling a single lamb, but appearances, as the Varathi Empire was about to learn, could be very deceiving. Squadron Commander Uthrex stood on the bridge of his cruiser, the Blade of Order, and looked at the tiny human vessel floating in the center of his formation with the kind of contempt that only a man who had never been truly challenged could feel. He was young for a squadron commander, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and hungry for the kind of victory that would push his career forward. And when he looked at the Perseverance, he saw nothing but an easy prize. "Open a channel," he ordered. His communications officer obeyed, and Uthrex straightened his posture, lifted his chin, and spoke in the cold, formal tone that the Imperial Navy used when addressing inferior species. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered sovereign territory of the Varathi Empire without authorization. You will shut down your engines immediately, lower any defensive systems, and prepare to be boarded for inspection. Failure to comply will result in the immediate use of force. You have 60 Imperial seconds." He cut the channel and smiled to himself, already imagining the commendation he would receive for capturing an alien vessel at the border. The response came back almost immediately, but it was not what he expected. A calm female voice filled his bridge, speaking in perfectly translated Varathi, with a warmth that seemed completely out of place given the circumstances. "Squadron Commander, this is Dr. Lena Moreau, diplomatic officer aboard the United Earth Navy vessel Perseverance. We are an envoy from the United Earth Coalition, and we have come seeking formal diplomatic contact with the Varathi Empire. We carry no hostile intentions, and we would be happy to transmit our credentials, cultural exchange packages, and a formal peace proposal for your review." Uthrex blinked. He had expected fear, confusion, perhaps desperate pleading, not a calm offer of diplomacy from a species that his empire had classified as barely more advanced than animals. "We are also transmitting full translation matrices so that your linguists may verify the accuracy of our communications," Dr. Moreau continued, "and we respectfully request the opportunity to speak with a senior representative of your government." Uthrex felt his face flush with irritation. This creature was speaking to him as if they were equals, as if a ship the size of a cargo shuttle had any right to make demands while surrounded by 12 warships. "You have 40 seconds remaining," he snapped. "Comply or be destroyed." On the bridge of the Perseverance, Dr. Moreau turned to Admiral Okoye with a look that said she had expected this, but had hoped for better. Okoye sat perfectly still in her chair for a moment, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display that showed 12 red dots arranged in a perfect circle around the single blue dot that represented her ship. "They are not going to talk," Moreau said quietly. "No," Okoye agreed. "Not yet." She pressed a button on her armrest and spoke clearly. "Volkov, activate the shroud." Down in the engineering bay, Chief Engineer Damir Volkov grinned the way a proud father grins when his child is about to perform on stage, and he pressed a sequence of controls on his console with fingers that moved fast and sure. "Shroud is active," he announced, and the Perseverance vanished. It did not cloak. Cloaking was a technology that the Varathi understood, a method of bending light and sensor waves around a ship to make it invisible. This was something entirely different. The Perseverance simply ceased to exist on every instrument the Varathi possessed. Thermal scanners showed nothing. Gravitational sensors detected no mass. Quantum resonance arrays read empty vacuum. Even the light that should have bounced off the hull was gone, as if the ship had never been there at all. On the bridge of the Blade of Order, Uthrex watched his displays go blank, and felt his confidence shatter like glass hitting stone. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Find it. Scan the entire sector." His sensor officers worked frantically, their fingers flying across their consoles. But every scan came back the same. Empty space in every direction. "It is gone, Commander," his chief sensor officer reported. And there was real fear in her voice. "All instruments read negative. The vessel is simply not there." Uthrex clenched his fists and made a decision born from panic rather than wisdom. "All ships, fire widespread pattern into the last known position. Full plasma barrage, now." 12 cruisers opened fire simultaneously, and the area of space where the Perseverance had been was torn apart by a storm of superheated plasma bolts and high-velocity kinetic rounds. Enough destructive power to reduce an asteroid to dust. and the barrage lasted for 15 seconds before Uthrex ordered a halt. Silence fell across the formation as sensors swept the kill zone. Nothing. No debris, no residual energy, no indication that anything had been hit, because the Perseverance was no longer there. It was behind them. The ship reappeared 300 kilometers to the rear of the entire Varathi formation, having moved that distance in less than a third of a second, a speed that should have been physically impossible for any vessel at sublight. And it sat there calmly, as if it had been waiting for them to finish their tantrum. Dr. Moreau's voice came through the communications channel again, and she still sounded polite. "We repeat, we come in peace. We would prefer not to demonstrate further." In the engineering bay of the Perseverance, Volkov was watching the sensor data from the Varathi barrage with the expression of a teacher watching a student struggle with a very simple math problem. "Their plasma containment efficiency is adorable," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "Barely 60% conversion. They are losing almost half their energy output as waste heat. Who designed these weapons?" He patted the reactor housing affectionately. "You would never embarrass me like that, would you?" he whispered to his engine. On the blade of order, Uthrex was no longer thinking about his career or his commendation. He was thinking about the fact that a ship 1/10 the size of his cruiser had just disappeared from the most advanced sensor technology in the galaxy, teleported behind his entire formation, and was now sitting there calmly, asking to talk. But Uthrex was young and proud and afraid, which is the most dangerous combination any commander can have. And instead of doing the smart thing, he did the brave thing, which in this case was also the stupid thing. "All ships," he ordered, his voice tight with desperation. "Lock weapons on the target. Full broadside. Fire." 12 cruisers turned their guns on the Perseverance and unleashed the most devastating barrage they were capable of. Plasma cannons, kinetic accelerators, missile batteries, a wall of destruction that could have cracked a small moon. The Perseverance did not move. It did not dodge. It did not activate the shroud again. It did not even try to evade. It simply took the hit. Every single shot struck the hull directly, and the officers on every Varathi bridge watched their screens, expecting to see the small ship torn to pieces. Instead, the hull of the Perseverance shimmered. It rippled like the surface of a silver lake disturbed by a stone. And then it went still. 0 damage. The adaptive metamaterial hull, a technology that humans had developed not from any alien blueprint, but from their own desperate need to survive in the hostile vacuum of space, had absorbed the full combined firepower of 12 Varathi warships and converted the energy into heat that was quietly radiated away into the void. Uthrex stared at his display and could not speak. On the Perseverance, Admiral Okoye closed her eyes for a moment and let out a slow breath. She had hoped, truly hoped, that it would not come to this, because she had not traveled all this way to fight. "Disable them," she said, and then added with quiet emphasis, "gently." The weapons officer nodded and began targeting. What happened next took exactly 11 seconds. The Perseverance fired a series of microbursts, tiny precisely aimed energy pulses, so accurate that they could have threaded a needle at 1,000 kilometers, and each burst struck the exact same point on each Varathi cruiser, the primary power conduit junction, a critical system that connected the main reactor to every other system on the ship. One by one, the lights on the 12 cruisers flickered and died. No explosions, no hull breaches, no casualties. Just 12 warships going dark, their engines silent, their weapons cold, their crews alive and unharmed, but completely helpless, drifting in the black like leaves on a still pond. The Perseverance had not destroyed them because it had never intended to destroy them. It had simply turned them off, the way a patient adult might take a dangerous toy from a child who did not understand what they were playing with. Dr. Moreau opened the communications channel one final time, and her voice was the same as it had been from the beginning, warm and patient and sincere. "We still come in peace. May we speak with someone in charge." On the dark bridge of the Blade of Order, where the only light came from the faint glow of emergency panels, Squadron Commander Uthrex sat in his command chair, surrounded by silence. His crew stared at blank screens. His weapons were dead. His engines were dead. His pride was dead. He looked out through the observation window. The small, silver ship that hung motionless against the stars. And he whispered the question that every being in the Varathi Empire would soon be asking. The report arrived on Fleet Overseer Kethalin's console like a bomb wrapped in polite language. 12 cruisers disabled in 11 seconds, all crews alive and unharmed. The human vessel undamaged after absorbing a full combined broadside. Current status of the intercept fleet, drifting without power, awaiting rescue tugs. Kethalin read it twice, just as Rillis had scanned the human ship twice, and just like Rillis, he found that reading it again did not make it any easier to believe. He stood alone in his private command chamber, aboard the Throne of Silence, and for the first time in 40 years of service, he felt the cold crawl of something he refused to call fear moving up his spine. He pressed a control on his desk and opened the Imperial Archives, pulling up the file on Species 7749, Homo sapiens, humans. The file was thin, almost insultingly so, because the Varathi Empire did not waste detailed records on species it considered irrelevant. Classification: Class 11, Pre-Warp Civilization, Homeworld, third planet of a G-type yellow dwarf star, designated Sol. Notable traits: tribal social structures, internal territorial conflicts, crude electromagnetic communications. Threat assessment: none. Survey date: 300 imperial years prior. Recommendation: no further observation required for minimum 1,000 years. Kethalin stared at these words and felt a strange bitter taste in his mouth, because these words had been written by people who considered themselves the most intelligent beings in the galaxy, and those people had been completely and catastrophically wrong. He pressed another control. "Connect me to the Imperial Intelligence Division," he ordered. "I want a full reassessment of Species 7749. Pull every piece of monitoring data we have from their star system for the past 3 centuries. I want it on my desk within the hour." The intelligence report arrived 53 minutes later, compiled by a team of analysts who had clearly been shaken by what they found. And as Kethalin read it, the story of what had happened to humanity over the past 300 years unfolded before him like a nightmare that the Empire had slept through. 3 centuries ago, a Varathi survey drone had passed through the Sol system on a routine mapping mission. It had spent less than a day there, cataloging the planets, scanning the dominant species, and moving on. And the Varathi who operated that drone had not given the system a second thought. But the drone had left something behind. Not intentionally, not anything physical, but a trace, a faint quantum wake in the fabric of space that lingered for several years after the drone departed. And the humans found it. They did not know what it was. Their science at that time was nowhere near advanced enough to understand quantum fold signatures. But they detected it with their primitive instruments, and they knew with absolute certainty that it was not natural. It was not a meteor trail or a solar wind pattern or any phenomenon they had ever recorded. It was something else. Something that had been made, and that meant something had made it. The humans looked at that faint trace in their sky and understood in their bones what it meant. They were not alone in the universe, and whatever was out there was far more advanced than they were. For most species in the galaxy, such a discovery would have been cause for celebration, or perhaps curiosity, or at best, a slow and measured increase in scientific funding. Humans did not react like most species. They reacted like prey animals who had just caught the scent of a predator. Fear, Raw, ancient, survival-driven fear tore through human civilization like fire through dry grass. And within a single generation, everything changed. Did not stop overnight. Humans were still humans, but the nature of their conflicts shifted dramatically. Because it is very hard to care about borders and flags when you have just learned that something unknown and powerful is moving through your neighborhood. Governments that had spent centuries competing with each other began cooperating, not out of idealism or kindness, but out of the simple understanding that divided they would be helpless, and united they might have a chance. Resources that had been poured into weapons designed to kill other humans were redirected into science, into space exploration, into the desperate, urgent work of making sure that when whatever was out there came back, humanity would not be caught defenseless. And they moved fast, faster than any species the galaxy had ever seen. Within 80 years of finding the quantum wake, humans achieved stable fusion power, a milestone that had taken the Varathi Empire 600 years. Within 120 years, they built their first faster-than-light engine. And this was the detail that made Ketvalan's hands go cold. Because humans had never captured alien technology, never reverse-engineered a single piece of Varathi equipment, never even seen a working example of FTL travel. They had invented it entirely on their own, from scratch, working from nothing but mathematics and sheer stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible. Within 200 years, they had colonized 12 star systems, building outposts and stations and shipyards with the frantic energy of a species that was preparing for a storm it could not see, but knew was coming. Within 250 years, they had developed military technology that followed a design philosophy completely unlike anything else in the galaxy. And this was the part that truly disturbed Ketvalan, because he was a military man and he understood warship design the Tampacelian way a painter understands color, and what the humans had built made no sense by any standard he knew. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy designed their warships to project power. Bigger guns, more missiles, faster engines, greater range. The philosophy was always the same. Be strong enough to destroy your enemy before they can destroy you. Humans had not done this. Humans had designed their ships to survive. Their hulls were made of adaptive metamaterials that could absorb and redistribute energy. Their reactors had triple redundant failsafe systems so that no single failure could cripple a vessel. Their life support was designed to function even if 90% of the ship was destroyed. Their weapons were precise not because humans valued elegance, but because humans could not afford to waste a single shot. Every design choice, every engineering decision, every bolt and wire and circuit on a human ship told the same story. Had spent its entire existence surviving things that should have killed it. And it had carried that lesson into the stars. Ice ages, plagues, famines, wars, asteroid impacts, climate disasters. Humanity had nearly gone extinct more times than most species had faced a single, serious challenge. And each time they had survived, they had learned the same lesson. The universe is trying to kill you, so build everything to last. The Perseverance was not even a dedicated warship. The intelligence report confirmed this with a note of almost bewildered disbelief. It was a deep space exploration vessel, a ship designed primarily for long-range scientific missions, equipped with defensive systems as a precaution that had just shrugged off the combined firepower of 12 Varathi cruisers. Ketvalan closed the report and sat in silence for a very long time. His second-in-command, Dreth, entered the chamber after a while, and he could see from Ketvalan's expression that whatever the overseer had read, it had changed something fundamental in the way he understood the universe. "What did the report say?" Dreth asked. Ketvalan looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than they had been an hour ago. "They went from chemical rockets to this in 300 years, he said quietly. "It took us 9,000. Dreth was silent for a moment, processing this. "What are your orders, Overseer?" Ketvalan stood and straightened his uniform, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. because whatever he was feeling inside, he was still a commander, and his people needed him to be calm. "Mobilize the full Imperial border fleet," he said. "Not to attack, to escort. We will bring the human vessel to the capital world, and let the diplomats handle this, because I have just read the most frightening intelligence report of my career, and I am not going to start a war with a species that accomplished in 3 centuries what we could not do in 9 millennia. Dreth hesitated, then asked the question that was burning in his mind. "Overseer, are we afraid of them?" Kethvalen looked at him, and for a moment the mask of command slipped, and Dreth saw something raw and honest beneath it. "No," Kethvalen said, "I am afraid of what they will become in another 300 years. He turned away and began issuing orders, and across the border 200 Imperial warships began moving into formation, not as a war fleet, but as an honor guard, though none of them would have used that word out loud. And somewhere in the space between the stars, the Perseverance waited patiently, its hull gleaming faintly in the starlight, crewed by humans who had crawled out of caves and crossed an ocean of fire and darkness, to stand here at the edge of an empire that had ruled the galaxy since before their species had learned to write. Peace. They intended to leave in peace, but they had built their ship to survive anything, because humans always did. The capital world of the Varathi Empire was called Varath Prime, and it was the kind of place that made visitors forget how to breathe. The entire planet was a city, an endless landscape of crystalline spires that caught the light of 3 suns and scattered it into rainbows that danced across towers, stretching so high they pierced the clouds. Monuments older than most civilizations covered the surface, each one a testament to 12,000 years of unbroken rule. And at the center of it all stood the Imperial Palace, a structure so vast that it had its own weather system forming in the spaces between its highest walls. The Perseverance arrived in orbit around Varath Prime, escorted by over 200 Imperial warships. And if the formation was intended to make the humans feel small, it succeeded in the opposite way. Because millions of Varathi citizens crowded onto observation platforms and rooftops and balconies to stare up at the tiny silver ship that had become the most talked about object in the Empire. Rumors of the border incident had spread across every information network within hours. 12 cruisers disabled in 11 seconds, a ship that could vanish from the most advanced sensors in the galaxy, a hull that absorbed a full broadside without a scratch. And by the time the Perseverance reached the capital, every citizen on Varath Prime knew that something extraordinary was happening. Now, Admiral Naya Okoye stood in her quarters aboard the Perseverance and looked at herself in the mirror as she straightened the collar of her dress uniform. It was a simple uniform, dark navy blue with silver trim and a single row of medals on the chest, nothing like the elaborate jeweled armor that Varathi officers wore. But Okoye had not chosen this uniform to impress anyone. She had chosen it because it was honest, and she believed that honesty was the most powerful weapon a diplomat could carry. Ready? The doorway. As much as anyone can be ready to walk into the heart of an empire that wants to know why we are not afraid of it, Okoye replied. They took a shuttle down to the surface, Okoye, Moreau, and a small diplomatic team of 6. And they were met at the landing platform by an escort of Imperial guards in gleaming silver armor, who led them through corridors of polished crystal into the Hall of 10,000 Stars. The name was not poetic exaggeration. The ceiling of the hall was a living map of the galaxy, with 10,000 tiny points of light representing every star system under Varathi control, and they burned overhead like a private sky that belonged to the Empress alone. And there, at the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from a single piece of pale stone that was older than human civilization itself, was Empress Selith Varan. She was the 407th ruler of the Varathi Empire, and the longest reigning empress in recorded history. Looked exactly like what she was, ancient, powerful, and utterly in control. Her skin was the pale silver of her species, lined with the delicate patterns that Varathi developed with extreme age, and her eyes were deep gold and sharp enough to cut through any lie ever told. She watched the human delegation walk toward her across the vast floor of the hall, and she studied Admiral Okoye the way a scientist studies a specimen that has just done something unexpected. She had been briefed on everything: the border incident, the intelligence report, the impossible speed of human development. And she had expected the human commander to be a warlord, a conqueror, someone who carried the swagger of a species that knew it was powerful. Instead, she saw a calm woman who walked with steady steps and stood with the patience of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. The formal ceremony began with the traditional Varathi protocols: introductions, declarations of intent, the ritual exchange of credentials, and Dr. Moreau handled all of it with a grace and cultural sensitivity that impressed even the most skeptical members of the imperial court. Then came the substance. Moreau presented humanity's proposal clearly and simply: mutual recognition of sovereignty, trade agreements based on fair exchange, shared scientific research programs, and a formal non-aggression pact binding both civilizations to peaceful coexistence. The terms were generous, remarkably so, and as the court digested them, a wave of suspicion rippled through the assembled nobles and advisors, like wind through tall grass. Because in 12,000 years of Varathi history, the strong had never offered peace to the weak without a hidden motive. Power was meant to be used, and a species that could disable 12 warships in 11 seconds should by all logic be demanding tribute, not offering friendship. A senior advisor leaned toward the Empress and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "This is a trick, Your Radiance. They show us kindness now, so that we lower our guard, and then they will strike." Others murmured agreement. The Empress raised one hand, and the hall fell silent instantly. She looked directly at Admiral Okoye, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Admiral, your ship absorbed the full firepower of our cruisers without damage. Your technology surpasses ours in ways my scientists are still struggling to comprehend. You could burn this world if you chose to." She paused. "Why do you not?" The hall held its breath. Okoye met the Empress's gaze without flinching, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of that enormous room. "Because we have already burned our own," she said. "We know what it costs." The silence that followed was absolute. "My species nearly destroyed itself more times than I can count," Okoye continued. "We poisoned our own air, heated our own oceans, built weapons that could have ended all life on our world, and came within minutes of using them. We fought wars over land, over resources, over ideas, over nothing at all, and every time we pulled ourselves back from the edge, we carried the scars forward." She took a breath. "We did not come here to build an empire, Your Radiance. We have seen what empires cost from the inside. We came here because we have been alone for a very long time, and we are tired of being alone. We do not want subjects or territory or tribute. We want neighbors." The court was stunned, not because the words were eloquent, but because every person in that room could hear the truth in them, raw and unpolished, and impossible to fake. Then a figure stepped forward from the ranks of the court, a tall, thin Varathi with the distinctive markings of a high scholar, wearing the simple robes of the academic class, rather than the elaborate garments of the nobility. This was High Scholar Zendrik, the Empire's chief scientist, and he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Your Radiance," he said, bowing to the Empress, "I request permission to address the court." The Empress nodded. Zendrik turned to face the assembled nobles and advisors, and spoke in a voice that was calm and measured, but carried the authority of someone who dealt in facts rather than opinions. "For over a century, I have been privately monitoring human transmissions, their radio signals, their digital communications, Their scientific publications, their art and music and literature. I have studied them more thoroughly than any other scholar in the empire, and I must share what I have learned." He paused to let the weight of his next words settle. "Humans are the fastest evolving sapient species ever recorded in galactic history. Not just technologically, but culturally, artistically, and intellectually. In terms of raw adaptive potential, they surpass every known civilization in our records." The court erupted, voices shouting accusations of treason, of fear-mongering, of heresy against the Empire's foundational belief in Varathi supremacy. And for a moment, the hall descended into chaos. Zendrik waited patiently for the noise to die down, and then he continued, as if he had not been interrupted. "But that is precisely why we should accept their offer," he said. "If we make an enemy of humanity today, we will not survive what they become tomorrow. Their rate of advancement is accelerating, not slowing. In another century, they will surpass us so completely that conflict would not be war, but extinction." He let that word hang in the air. "However, if we make them an ally, if we join our knowledge to theirs and walk forward together, then we do not merely survive, we share in what they become. Their creativity combined with our experience, their adaptability combined with our stability, together, we would be something the galaxy has never seen." The hall was quiet now, not the angry quiet of before, but the thoughtful quiet of people who were beginning to understand that the universe had just changed, and they could either change with it or be left behind. The Empress sat motionless on her throne for a very long time, and every eye in the hall was fixed on her, waiting. Then she did something that no living person in the room had ever witnessed, something that her closest advisors would later say they had not believed possible. She smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of her silver lips, but it transformed her face from a mask of imperial authority into something almost warm. "Draft the treaty," she commanded. And the hall of 10,000 stars erupted, not in protest, but in the stunned, breathless murmur of an empire that had just taken its first step into a future it could not predict, but had chosen to embrace. Admiral Okoye allowed herself one small moment of relief, a slight softening of her shoulders that only Moreau noticed, and then she stepped forward to meet the Empress's representative and begin the work that she had crossed the galaxy to do. Behind her, Dr. Moreau wiped her eyes quickly and pretended she had not been crying, and in orbit above the planet, Chief Engineer Volkov received the news and celebrated by falling asleep at his console for the first time in 4 days, a smile on his exhausted face. 6 months had passed since the day a small silver ship had flown into the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy and changed everything. The Varith Earth Accord was signed on a morning when all 3 of Varith Prime's suns were visible in the sky at once, casting the Imperial Palace in a light so golden that even the most cynical observers admitted it felt like the universe was paying attention. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, and then faster, carried by every communication relay and information network that existed, and the reaction was immediate and enormous. Dozens of other species, many of whom had lived under Varithi dominance for thousands of years, accepting their place in the hierarchy because they had never imagined an alternative, began sending messages to the United Earth Coalition requesting their own diplomatic channels. For the first time in 12 millennia, the smaller civilizations of the galaxy looked at the order of things and thought that perhaps it could be different, not because humanity had conquered anyone, but because humanity had walked up to the throne of the most powerful empire ever known and offered a handshake instead of a fist, and the empire had accepted. On Varath Prime, the cultural exchange programs began within weeks of the treaty signing, and what happened next surprised everyone, including the humans. Varathi scholars, who had spent their entire careers studying the cold, precise sciences of empire, engineering, weapons development, resource extraction, were suddenly exposed to something they had no framework for: human art. A Varathi musician named Thesson, who had performed nothing but the mathematical compositions approved by imperial cultural standards for her entire life, was invited to a demonstration by the human cultural attaché, and she sat in a small room aboard the Perseverance and listened to a human symphony for the first. It was Beethoven's Seventh, a piece of music written by a man who could not hear, played by instruments made of wood and metal and gut, composed not by algorithm or mathematical formula, but by pure human emotion poured into sound, like water poured into a vessel that could barely contain it. Thesson wept. She sat in her chair with silver tears running down her face, and her hands gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles went pale, and when the music ended, she could not speak for several minutes. When she finally found her voice, she asked a single question: "Why does it hurt?" The human musician who had played the recording for her, a young cellist named Marco, looked at her with gentle eyes and said, "Because it is supposed to. It is how we share the things we cannot say with words." Thesson later wrote in her personal journal that in that moment she understood something that the Varathi Empire had forgotten thousands of years ago: that beauty and pain are not opposites but partners, and that a civilization that abandons one will inevitably lose the other. She was not the only Varathi who had this experience. Across the capital, in the cultural exchange centers and meeting halls, and even in the corridors of the palace itself, Varathi citizens were discovering human music, human painting, human literature, human poetry, and they were being changed by it in ways that no weapon or warship could ever have achieved. The humans had not conquered the Varathi. They had reminded them of something they had lost. Down in the engineering bays beneath the palace, a very different kind of exchange was happening. Chief Engineer Damir Volkov had become the most popular human on Varath Prime, not because of his charm, which was minimal, or his social skills, which were almost non-existent, but because he was willing to share. Varathi engineers surrounded him like students around a beloved professor, firing questions at him faster than the translation systems could process, and Volkov answered every single one with the passionate enthusiasm of a man who loved his work more than sleep, food, or personal hygiene. He showed them the principles behind adaptive metamaterial hull technology, not the exact blueprints, not yet, because some things required trust that would take time to build, but the foundational science, the concepts, the way of thinking that had led humanity to develop materials that could learn and respond to threats in real time. In exchange, the Varathi engineers shared their quantum-fold navigation data, the mathematics behind their faster-than-light travel, which was in many ways more elegant than humanity's brute force approach, and Volkov studied it with the wide-eyed wonder of a child discovering a new toy. "This is beautiful," he whispered, tracing the equations on a Varathi crystal display. "Your fold geometry is so clean. Forcing our way through space like a hammer through a wall. And you have been finding the doors." It was the first time a human had complimented Varathi technology since the Perseverance had arrived, and the Varathi engineers stood a little taller when they heard it. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Damir Volkov slept a full 8 hours without waking once, and when his assistant found him the next morning, he was still smiling. Elsewhere on Varath Prime, Fleet Overseer Keth Valan, now formally reassigned as the Imperial Military Liaison to the human delegation, sat across a table from Admiral Naya Okoye in a small dining room in the diplomatic quarter. They had developed an unlikely relationship over the past months. Not friendship exactly, because Keth Valan was not a man who made friends easily, and Okoye was not a woman who trusted easily, but something close to it, a mutual respect that had grown slowly and steadily, like a tree putting down roots. down roots in rocky soil. They shared a meal. It had been discovered early in the cultural exchange that humans and Varathi could eat some of the same foods, which had pleased the diplomatic teams enormously, because nothing builds trust faster than breaking bread together. Kethvalan set down his eating instrument and looked at Okoye with those pale gray eyes that she had learned to read over many conversations. "When I first saw your ship on my sensors," he said, "I thought it was a mistake, an instrument error, a glitch in the deep light array, because nothing in my experience had prepared me for the idea that a species we had dismissed could build something like that." He paused. "Now I think the only mistake was that we did not look sooner." Okoye took a sip of her drink and considered his words. "We were always there," she said. "You just did not think we were worth watching." There was no accusation in her voice, just a simple truth, delivered with the calm directness that Kethvalan had come to respect more than any tactical brilliance. "That will not happen again," he said. "No," she agreed. "It will not." In a quiet garden on the palace grounds, a memorial garden that honored the species the Varathi Empire had conquered or destroyed over 12,000 years of expansion, Dr. Lena Moreau walked alone among the monuments. Each stone marker represented a civilization that had once existed and now did not. Some had been absorbed into the empire, their cultures diluted and eventually erased. And some had been destroyed outright, their worlds reduced to resources and their people reduced to footnotes in imperial history. Moreau stopped in front of a marker that bore no name, only a date, a species so thoroughly erased that even their identity had been lost. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a pressed flower encased in clear resin, a daisy from Earth, preserved and carried across the stars, and she placed it gently at the base of the unnamed marker. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scale of galactic politics, but Moreau was not thinking about politics. She was thinking about all the civilizations that had never gotten the chance that humanity had been given, the ones that had been scanned and dismissed and forgotten, just as humanity had been, but who had not been lucky enough, or fast enough, or stubborn enough to survive until they could stand as equals. She stood there for a long time, and then she walked away. 3 weeks later, High Scholar Zendrik published a paper that became the most widely read academic work in the history of the Varathi Empire. It was translated into every known galactic language within days, and discussed on every inhabited world within weeks. Its title was simple: On the Consequences of Underestimating a Class 11 Species, and its conclusion was even so, simpler. The galaxy was no longer what it had been, and any civilization that failed to recognize this would be left behind. The final scene of this story does not take place in a throne room, or a conference hall, or a battlefield. It takes place on the observation deck of the UEN Perseverance, which was now departing Varathi space to continue its original mission, deep space exploration, the purpose for which it had been built, long before anyone knew it would become the most famous ship in galactic history. Admiral Okoye stood at the viewport, watching the stars slide past as the ship gathered speed. Volkov appeared beside her, holding a cup of coffee that he had somehow convinced the Varathi food synthesizers to produce, though he admitted it tasted slightly like copper. "Do you think they will keep the peace?" he asked. Okoye was quiet for a moment. "They scanned us twice, and still could not believe what they saw," she said. "That kind of surprise either starts wars or ends them. We just made sure it was the second one." Volkov nodded and sipped his terrible coffee and said nothing else, because sometimes the best conversations end in silence. The Perseverance engaged its engines and leaped into the dark space between stars, small and blunt and unbeautiful, built not for glory, but for survival, crewed by humans who had crawled out of mud and learned to walk upright and survived ice and fire and their own worst impulses, and kept going anyway, because that was what humans did. They kept going. Behind them, the Varathi Deep Light Array logged the ship's departure, and a sensor operator updated the Imperial database with the new classification for species 7749. It was a designation that had never been used before in 12,000 years of record-keeping. Class 0. Pure Civilization. The sensor operator stared at those words for a long time, and then she added a personal note to the file. Annotation that protocol did not require, but that she felt compelled to write, and that would be quoted and shared and remembered for centuries to come. They did not conquer us. They did not threaten us. They showed up, absorbed a full broadside without flinching, and asked to be friends. Somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. She saved the file and closed her console, and above her, the stars burned on, vast and ancient and full of wonders that no single species could explore alone. But they would not have to. Not anymore.